Waitress said, "It was my grandmother's." Millionaire fainted with necklace in his hands. "Before we begin, tell me something about where you live. What's the weather like today?" The rain drummed against the windows of Romano's, an upscale restaurant in Manhattan's Upper East Side, as Alexander Whitmore adjusted his Italian silk tie and surveyed the elegant dining room through calculating eyes. At 45, he commanded a fortune built on real estate empires and tech investments, but tonight he sat alone at table 12, nursing a glass of vintage Bordeaux while orchestrating what he privately called his humanity tests. And the sterling silver necklace in his jacket pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, its intricate Celtic knots and embedded emeralds representing something far more valuable than the $30,000 he'd paid for it at Sotheby's auction house just 3 days prior. This wasn't his first such experiment, nor would it be his last, unless tonight somehow proved different from all the disappointments that had preceded it. Alexander had developed this peculiar and increasingly obsessive hobby over the past 2 years, ever since his wife Margaret had died in a car accident on a rainy night, much like this one, leaving him not just widowed, but profoundly questioning the nature of human character and the fundamental goodness he'd once believed existed in people's hearts. The accident had been caused by a drunk driver who fled the scene, leaving Margaret to die alone on a dark stretch of highway while passing motorists drove by without stopping to help. The investigation revealed that at least 7 people had seen the wreckage and chosen not to get involved, not wanting to complicate their evening plans or risk any personal inconvenience. That revelation had shattered something essential in Alexander's worldview, replacing his natural optimism with a bitter cynicism that grew stronger with each passing month. In the months following Margaret's funeral, Alexander had begun conducting elaborate tests of human nature, deliberately placing expensive items in situations where ordinary people might find them, then observing their reactions through hidden cameras or carefully positioned accomplices. A Rolex left accidentally in a taxi with a tracker inside, a diamond bracelet dropped in a coffee shop while he pretended to read nearby, a rare painting left unattended in a hotel lobby while he watched from behind a newspaper. The results had been consistently and depressingly predictable. 90% of people, when faced with valuable items that clearly didn't belong to them, chose personal gain over integrity, often with elaborate mental gymnastics to justify their theft as somehow deserved or harmless. He'd watched a grandmother pocket a lost wedding ring while her granddaughter played nearby, seen a priest slip an expensive watch into his coat during a charity event, witnessed teachers and doctors and supposed pillars of society reveal their true nature when they thought no one was watching. Each test had reinforced his growing conviction that money corrupts everything and everyone, eventually, and that Margaret's faith in human goodness had been nothing more than naive idealism. The hobby had become an addiction, a compulsive need to prove over and over again that the world was as dark as he'd come to believe it was. Tonight's test subject was Emma Rodriguez, a 28-year-old waitress who had been working at Romano's for 3 years, ever since she'd graduated from Queen's College, with a degree in social work that had proven frustratingly unmarketable in an economy that valued profit over compassion. Alexander had been observing her for weeks, initially attracted by her obvious competence and professionalism, but gradually becoming intrigued by subtler qualities that seemed increasingly rare in his experience. He'd watched her comfort an elderly customer who'd received bad news during dinner, seen her quietly pay for a young couple's meal when their credit card was declined, observed her staying late to help the kitchen staff clean up after particularly busy nights without being asked or expecting additional compensation. Emma had grown up in Queens, the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything for their children's education and opportunities in America. Her father, Carlos, worked double shifts at a construction company while taking night classes to improve his English, dreaming of someday starting his own business. Her mother, Maria, cleaned office buildings from midnight to dawn, then came home to care for her family and maintain their small apartment with the same meticulous attention she brought to her professional duties. They had invested every spare dollar in their children's futures, believing with unshakable faith that education and hard work would eventually lift the family into the middle-class security that had always eluded their own generation. The Rodriguez family's financial struggles had intensified 5 years earlier when Emma's younger brother Miguel was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder that required expensive treatments not covered by their limited insurance. Faced with mounting medical bills that threatened to bankrupt the family, they had been forced to make increasingly desperate choices. Maria had sold her mother's wedding ring. Carlos had taken a third job that left him exhausted and hollow-eyed, and eventually they had been compelled to part with their most treasured possession, the Celtic necklace that had belonged to Emma's great-grandmother, Bridget O'Sullivan, who had brought it from County Cork when she immigrated to America in 1952. The necklace had been more than just jewelry to the family. It was a tangible connection to ancestors they'd never known, a symbol of resilience and hope that had sustained 3 generations of women through poverty, discrimination, and countless small daily struggles. Bridget had worn it on her wedding day, during the birth of her children, and throughout the long years of building a new life in a foreign country. It had passed to Emma's grandmother, then to her mother, and was destined to be Emma's inheritance until financial desperation forced them to sell it to a private collector who had resold it to the auction house where Alexander eventually purchased it. Emma worked 2 jobs to support her family's ongoing expenses and Miguel's continued treatment, never complaining despite the exhaustion that sometimes showed in her dark eyes and the way her shoulders sagged at the end of particularly difficult shifts. She waited tables at Romano's 5 nights a week, then spent her mornings working as a teacher's aide at an elementary school in her neighborhood, helping children who reminded her of her younger self navigate the complexities of learning English while maintaining their cultural identity. Every spare moment was dedicated to her family or to volunteer work with local immigrant communities, translating documents, helping with job applications, and providing the kind of practical support that government agencies and charitable organizations often failed to offer. Despite these crushing responsibilities and the constant financial pressure that dictated every decision in her life, Emma carried herself with quiet dignity that never descended into self-pity or resentment. She possessed an authenticity that seemed almost anachronistic in Alexander's world of corporate sharks and social climbers, where every interaction was calculated for advantage and every relationship served some ultimately selfish purpose. There was something about her smile that reminded him of Margaret, a warmth that seemed to come from genuine kindness rather than professional obligation or social manipulation. When she served customers, her attention was completely present, treating each person as worthy of respect, regardless of their apparent wealth or social status. Alexander had studied Emma's behavior with the same methodical attention he brought to his business ventures, looking for cracks in her facade of integrity that would reveal the selfishness he was certain lay beneath everyone's surface persona. He'd left increasingly valuable items within her reach: a gold pen, an expensive tie clip, a wallet containing several $100s in cash. Each time, Emma had either ignored the items entirely or immediately turned them over to management, never even appearing tempted by possessions that could have made a significant difference in her family's circumstances. Her consistency was beginning to unnerve him, challenging assumptions that had become central to his post-Margaret worldview. As Emma approached his table with practiced grace, Alexander felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied these experiments. She was petite, but carried herself with the kind of inner strength that came from surviving genuine hardship without becoming hardened by the experience. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized the classical lines of her face, and her uniform was impeccably clean despite having worked a double shift that had begun at 10 that morning. There was something in her eyes that Alexander recognized but couldn't quite name, a quality that seemed to see through surface appearances to some deeper truth about the people she encountered. Tonight's test would be different from the others, Alexander had decided. The necklace was worth more than anything he'd used before, valuable enough to solve most of Emma's immediate problems and provide her family with genuine financial relief. If she could resist this temptation, if she could maintain her integrity when faced with an object that could literally change her life, then perhaps there was something to Margaret's faith in human goodness after all. If she failed, if she succumbed like all the others, then he would finally have his definitive proof that even the most seemingly virtuous people had their price. When Emma refilled his wine glass, Alexander made his move, deliberately knocking his napkin to the floor while simultaneously sliding the necklace from his pocket onto his chair seat with the practiced smoothness of long experience. The necklace caught the restaurant's ambient lighting, its emeralds throwing tiny green reflections across the white tablecloth like captured starlight, the Celtic knots seeming to shift and dance in the flickering candlelight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail revealing the love and skill of artisans who had created not just jewelry, but a work of art meant to last for generations. Alexander excused himself to the restroom, positioning himself where he could observe through the service station's one-way mirror that he'd discovered during previous reconnaissance visits. His heart raced with the familiar thrill of the experiment, but this time there was something else mixed with the anticipation, a strange reluctance that he couldn't quite identify. Emma returned to clear his appetizer plate, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to conserve energy during long shifts, and he watched her freeze as she spotted the necklace nestled against the chair's burgundy leather upholstery. Emma's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her hand went to her throat instinctively, fingers tracing the outline of a chain that was no longer there, and she glanced around the restaurant with the careful awareness of someone who had learned to be cautious in situations that seemed too good to be true. Alexander held his breath, expecting her to pocket the jewelry like so many others before her, already composing the bitter satisfaction he would feel at having his cynicism confirmed once again. Instead, Emma carefully picked up the necklace, holding it with a reverence that seemed oddly personal, and immediately flagged down Roberto, the night manager. From his hidden vantage point, Alexander listened as Emma explained the situation to Roberto, her voice carrying a slight tremor that he initially attributed to nervousness at handling such an obviously valuable item. Her concern seemed genuine as she described finding the expensive-looking piece and expressed worry that a customer might be frantically searching for it, possibly unaware that they had lost something so precious. Roberto's reaction was predictable and disappointing. Alexander had observed him before and knew him to be a man of flexible ethics who supplemented his legitimate income through various questionable schemes. Roberto's eyes immediately began calculating the necklace's potential value, and he suggested they hold on to it for a few days to see if anyone claimed it, his meaning clear to anyone familiar with such euphemisms. But Emma shook her head firmly, her voice taking on a strength that surprised Alexander with its quiet authority. She insisted they check with every table immediately to find the owner, arguing that someone was probably desperate with worry over losing something so obviously precious and meaningful. The passion in her voice suggested personal experience with loss, and Alexander found himself wondering what she might have lost that could produce such empathy for a stranger's misfortune. Roberto's attempts to dissuade her were met with polite but unyielding determination, and eventually he agreed to help her search for the necklace's owner, though his reluctance was obvious to anyone paying attention. Alexander felt a strange flutter in his chest as he watched this young woman, who probably earned in a year what he spent on a weekend getaway, prioritize a stranger's property over any potential windfall that could have transformed her family's circumstances. There was something about her behavior that went beyond mere honesty. It suggested a fundamental worldview that placed other people's well-being before her own self-interest, even when that self-interest was desperately needed and entirely understandable. He had seen honest people before, individuals who returned lost items out of duty or social conditioning, but Emma's response seemed to come from a deeper place, rooted in genuine compassion rather than abstract moral principles. When Alexander returned to his table, Emma was waiting with barely contained excitement, her face radiant with the kind of joy that comes from being able to help someone else. The necklace lay nestled in a clean cloth napkin, treated with the careful respect usually reserved for religious relics or priceless artifacts. As she handed it to him, her fingers briefly touched his, and Alexander was struck by how rough they were from years of hard work, calloused from constant contact with hot plates and cleaning chemicals, yet how gentle her touch remained. She began to pull away, but something in the necklace's design made her pause, her breath catching in her throat as she looked more closely at the Celtic patterns and emerald arrangement. The change in Emma's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a shift from professional satisfaction to something much more personal and profound. Her face went pale, and her hands began to shake slightly as she continued to study the necklace with growing intensity. There was something desperate in her expression now, a hunger that had nothing to do with monetary value and everything to do with recognition. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the restaurant's gentle buzz of conversation and clinking silverware. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her eyes never leaving the necklace's intricate design. "But could I ask where you got this? The pattern is so unusual, so specific. I've never seen anything quite like it except—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Alexander could see the tears beginning to form in her eyes. He described purchasing it at auction, mentioning that it had belonged to an Irish immigrant family who had fallen on hard times and been forced to sell their most treasured heirloom. As he spoke, providing details he'd learned from the auction catalogue, Emma's composure finally broke completely. The words that tumbled from Emma's lips next would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life, reshaping his understanding not just of this particular evening, but of the entire trajectory of choices and assumptions that had led him to this moment. "It was my grandmother's," she said, her voice breaking on each word as if speaking them caused physical pain. "My great-grandmother brought it from Ireland in 1952. It's been in our family for 4 generations. We had to sell it 5 years ago when my brother got sick." The statement hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Alexander felt the restaurant spinning around him as the full weight of what she'd said penetrated his consciousness. The coincidence was so staggering, so impossible, that his first instinct was to dismiss it as some elaborate scam. But the raw anguish in Emma's voice and the way her entire body seemed to collapse in on itself spoke of genuine grief that couldn't be manufactured. This wasn't calculated manipulation. This was the sound of a heart breaking all over again as old wounds were torn open by cruel chance. Emma continued in a voice thick with emotion and memories that seemed to be flooding back with overwhelming intensity. She explained how her great-grandmother Bridget O'Sullivan had brought the necklace from County Cork, where it had been made by local artisans as a wedding gift from her mother, who had died shortly before Bridget's departure for America. The necklace had been blessed by the village priest and imbued with protective charms according to ancient Celtic traditions. meant to keep the wearer connected to her ancestral homeland and protected from the dangers of life in a foreign country. Each generation of women in Emma's family had treasured the necklace not just as jewelry, but as a tangible link to their heritage and identity. It had been worn during christenings and confirmations, weddings and funerals, moments of celebration and times of desperate prayer. Emma's grandmother had clutched it during her husband's deployment in World War II. Her mother had worn it to her graduation from nursing school, and Emma herself had planned to wear it on her own wedding day, whenever that might come. The forced sale had felt like severing their family's spiritual roots, cutting them off from generations of ancestors whose love and sacrifice had made their American dream possible. The story poured out of Emma in broken fragments, interrupted by tears and long pauses as she struggled to maintain her composure in the middle of a busy restaurant. Alexander found himself leaning closer, drawn into the narrative despite his usual cynical detachment from other people's emotional displays. Emma described her mother's anguish at having to part with the necklace, how Maria had wept for days afterward and still sometimes unconsciously reached for it during moments of stress or prayer. The money from its sale had kept Miguel alive, paying for experimental treatments that their insurance company had deemed too costly and unproven, but the emotional cost had been devastating for the entire family. Alexander's legs gave out beneath him as the full implications of the situation crashed over him like a physical blow. He collapsed back into his chair, the necklace falling from his trembling fingers as consciousness briefly fled, overwhelmed by the cosmic irony of what had just transpired. Here he had been, conducting his cynical experiments in human nature, using this particular necklace as bait to prove people's fundamental selfishness. And the one person who had passed his test with flying colors was the very person who had the greatest legitimate claim to the object he was using to test her. When Alexander came to moments later, Emma was kneeling beside his chair, fanning him with a menu, while other staff members gathered around with expressions of concern and curiosity. Through the fog of his shock and the ringing in his ears, he could hear her voice offering water, asking if he needed medical attention, showing the same compassionate concern for his well-being that she had shown for every other human being he'd observed her interact with over the weeks of his surveillance. The necklace lay on the floor between them, no longer a tool for testing human nature, but a bridge connecting two souls across an impossible gulf of circumstance and fate. Roberto and several other restaurant employees had formed a protective circle around them, offering assistance and asking if they should call an ambulance. But Emma remained focused entirely on Alexander's condition, monitoring his breathing and pulse with the competent care of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies before. Her touch was professional but gentle, and Alexander found himself studying her face as his vision cleared, seeing not just her obvious beauty, but the character lines around her eyes, the premature worry creases on her forehead, the way she carried herself with dignity despite the uniform that marked her place in society's hierarchy. As Alexander's breathing steadied and color returned to his face, Emma helped him to his feet, her small frame supporting his larger one with surprising strength, born of years of physical labor and the kind of resilience that comes from shouldering responsibilities beyond her years. She guided him to a quieter corner booth where they could speak privately, away from the curious glances of other diners and the well-meaning but intrusive attention of the restaurant staff. The necklace remained on the floor where it had fallen, forgotten for the moment, as both of them struggled to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the relative privacy of the corner booth, Alexander found himself studying Emma with new eyes, seeing not a subject for his cruel experiments, but a real person whose life had intersected with his in ways that defied rational explanation. When she asked again about the necklace's history and how he had come to possess it, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of continuing the deception that had become second nature to him, Alexander began to tell her the truth about everything: his identity, his wealth, his bitter experiments with human nature, and most importantly, how her integrity had shattered every assumption he'd held about people's fundamental character. The confession poured out of him in waves, and Emma listened with growing amazement and something approaching horror, as this man she'd known only as a quiet, well-dressed customer revealed himself to be one of New York's most influential businessmen. Alexander described his wife Margaret's death in unflinching detail, the way it had destroyed his faith in human goodness and driven him to increasingly elaborate schemes to prove that everyone had their price. He admitted to orchestrating dozens of these tests over the past 2 years, always expecting the worst from people and being proven right time and again, until cynicism had become not just his worldview, but his religion. Emma's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, to something approaching anger, as Alexander revealed the full scope of his manipulative behavior. But it wasn't anger at being tested herself, so much as anger at the cynicism that had driven him to such lengths. She challenged him about his assumptions, pointing out with devastating logic that perhaps his negative expectations had influenced the outcomes of his previous experiments. Maybe people sensed his judgment and fulfilled his prophecies accordingly, or maybe he had unconsciously selected subjects who were more likely to disappoint him, confirming his biases while ignoring evidence that contradicted his predetermined conclusions. Her words cut through his defenses like a blade through silk, forcing him to confront the possibility that his own damaged worldview had been coloring his perception of humanity's true nature. Emma pressed him further, asking whether he had ever given people genuine opportunities to display virtue, or whether his tests had been designed from the beginning to reveal weakness and corruption. The questions were uncomfortable, because they highlighted flaws in his methodology that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge, too invested in his cynical conclusions to examine them critically. The conversation continued long past Emma's official shift end, with Roberto eventually joining them as other customers gradually left and the restaurant prepared to close. Alexander found himself sharing details about his life that he'd never told anyone, including aspects of his relationship with Margaret that he'd kept private even from close friends and family members. He described their shared dreams of starting a charitable foundation, their plans to use his wealth for social good, and how her death had poisoned those aspirations with bitterness and withdrawal from any meaningful engagement with the world beyond his business empire. Emma, in turn, spoke about her family's struggles with a dignity that never descended into self-pity or manipulation, even though she was clearly still processing the shock of seeing her grandmother's necklace again under such impossible circumstances. She described her mother's anguish at having to sell it, how Maria had avoided looking at jewelry stores for months afterward because the sight of necklaces would trigger overwhelming grief. She talked about her brother Miguel's guilt at being the cause of the family's financial crisis, how he had wanted to drop out of school and get a job despite being only 16 at the time, and how the whole family had worked together to ensure his treatments continued while maintaining some semblance of normal life. The more Emma talked about her family's response to their crisis, the more ashamed Alexander became of his own reaction to loss and disappointment. Where he had retreated into cynical isolation, testing strangers' virtue while contributing nothing positive to the world, Emma's family had pulled together, supporting each other through sacrifice and determination while maintaining their fundamental values and connection to their community. Their poverty had not made them bitter or grasping. It had deepened their appreciation for whatever good they could find in their circumstances and their commitment to helping others who faced similar challenges. When Roberto learned the truth about the necklace's provenance and Alexander's real identity, His reaction was immediate and decisive, though colored by his own guilt at having suggested they keep the valuable item rather than immediately seeking its rightful owner. He declared that Emma should take the necklace immediately, that it rightfully belonged to her family regardless of any legal technicalities about who had purchased it from the auction house. His vehemence seemed driven partly by genuine outrage at the situation's injustice and partly by a desire to demonstrate his own moral virtue after having revealed less admirable instincts earlier in the evening. But Emma, true to the character that had impressed Alexander from the beginning, refused to simply take something that he had legitimately purchased, regardless of its emotional significance to her family. The ethical implications were complex, she insisted, and she wouldn't accept charity or take advantage of his guilt over having unknowingly used her family's treasure as a prop in his psychological experiments. This response only deepened Alexander's respect for her integrity, even as it frustrated him in ways he couldn't fully articulate, challenging him to find a solution that would honor both her principles and the obvious injustice of the current situation. Roberto's own guilty conscience was revealed as the conversation continued, and he began making increasingly grandiose gestures of moral outrage, condemning Alexander's behavior while positioning himself as Emma's champion and protector. Alexander's business experience had made him expert at reading people's motivations, and he began to suspect that Roberto's theatrical virtue was masking some darker secret, possibly related to his earlier eagerness to keep the necklace rather than immediately seeking its owner. The way Roberto kept steering the conversation away from practical solutions toward abstract moral principles suggested someone more concerned with managing his own image than genuinely helping Emma. The following days blurred together in a haze of obsessive thinking as Alexander found himself unable to focus on his usual business activities, consumed instead by thoughts about Emma and the impossible coincidence that had brought them together. He researched her family's history, discovering that the O'Sullivans had indeed been forced to immigrate during Ireland's potato famine, part of a wave of desperate refugees fleeing starvation and oppression. Bridget's necklace had been one of the few valuable possessions her family had managed to retain through years of hardship, making its eventual loss all the more poignant. The more Alexander learned about the necklace's significance and the circumstances that had forced its sale, the more wrong it felt for him to keep it, yet Emma's refusal to simply accept it as a gift created a moral puzzle that consumed his thoughts and disrupted his sleep. He began visiting Romano's regularly, not to conduct experiments, but simply to see Emma and continue their conversations, drawn by her combination of strength and vulnerability, her ability to maintain hope and kindness despite circumstances that would have justified cynicism and despair. Through these regular visits, Alexander learned about Emma's dreams of opening a community center in her neighborhood, a place where immigrant families could get help with everything from English classes to job training to navigating the complex bureaucracy of American life. She had been saving money for years toward this goal, setting aside small amounts from her tips and wages despite her family's constant financial pressures, motivated by a vision of giving back to the community that had supported her family through their worst times. Her plans were detailed and thoughtful, based on extensive research into what services were most needed and most difficult to find. Emma, in turn, began to see past Alexander's wealth and cynicism to the wounded man beneath, recognizing that his bitter tests had been a symptom of grief rather than inherent cruelty. She listened to his stories about Margaret with genuine compassion, understanding how the loss of someone who had believed so strongly in human goodness could drive a person to desperately seek evidence that such faith was misplaced. Their unlikely friendship deepened into something more profound as they discovered shared interests in literature, philosophy, and social justice, finding common ground despite their vastly different backgrounds and life experiences. The necklace became a symbol of everything complex about their relationship, representing not just Emma's family heritage, but also Alexander's journey from cynicism towards something approaching redemption. He wanted desperately to return it to her family, but Emma's insistence that any gesture be earned rather than given created a challenge that intrigued him while forcing him to examine his own motivations. She proposed a test of her own. If Alexander could prove that his cynical worldview was wrong, if he could find evidence that human goodness existed without ulterior motives, then she would accept the necklace as a gift that honored both her family's heritage and his own transformation. Alexander threw himself into this challenge with the same intensity and methodical approach he'd once applied to his business ventures and his bitter experiments in human corruption. Instead of testing people's honesty with valuable objects, he began actively looking for examples of genuine altruism and selfless behavior, approaching the project with the same systematic thoroughness that had made him successful in the corporate world. He volunteered at homeless shelters, where Emma's co-workers from the community college program also donated their time, observing how people with limited resources still found ways to help those who had even less. He sponsored community events in Emma's neighborhood, not as photo opportunities or tax write-offs, but as genuine attempts to understand how people with modest means still manage to support each other through informal networks of mutual aid and cooperation. Alexander watched children share lunches with hungry classmates without being asked, saw elderly neighbors check on each other during storms and heat waves, witnessed strangers help accident victims without thought of reward or recognition. Slowly, methodically, he began to document instances of human kindness that existed purely for their own sake, behavior that contradicted everything he'd convinced himself was true about human nature. The research project became an obsession, but a healthy one that gradually began to heal the wounds Margaret's death had left in his soul. Alexander discovered that goodness existed everywhere once he began looking for it, with the same diligence he'd previously applied to finding corruption and selfishness. The examples multiplied until they formed an overwhelming body of evidence that challenged not just his conclusions, but the entire framework of assumptions on which those conclusions had been based. People were capable of remarkable generosity when given the opportunity and encouragement, when treated with respect rather than suspicion. Emma's influence extended beyond the intellectual exercise of cataloguing altruism. She introduced Alexander to her family, and he found himself welcomed with warmth and generosity by people who had every reason to resent someone of his privileged background. Miguel's gratitude for his sister's sacrifices was evident in every interaction. His determination to become a doctor motivated not by personal ambition, but by a desire to help families like his own navigate medical crises without losing everything they'd worked to build. The young man's maturity and sense of responsibility impressed Alexander, reminding him of his own younger self before wealth and cynicism had calcified his worldview. Emma's parents, Carlos and Maria, initially approached Alexander with understandable wariness, their experience having taught them to be cautious around wealthy people who showed sudden interest in their family. But as they got to know him through shared meals and long conversations conducted in a mixture of English and Spanish, with Emma translating when necessary, they began to see past his expensive clothes and obvious privilege to the lonely, grieving man beneath. Maria's maternal instincts were particularly aroused by Alexander's obvious pain, and she began treating him with the same nurturing care she showed her own children, making sure he ate properly and gently, scolding him when he looked tired or stressed. The extended Rodriguez family and their community network created a web of relationships that operated on principles entirely foreign to Alexander's previous experience. These were people who lent each other money without expecting interest, who took care of each other's children during emergencies, who shared resources and information and emotional support as naturally as breathing. Their generosity wasn't performative or calculated for advantage. It was simply how they lived, rooted in cultural values that prioritized community solidarity over individual advancement. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Alexander struggled against years of conditioned cynicism, finding himself suspicious of motives even when presented with clear evidence of selfless behavior. His default assumption had become that everyone was fundamentally selfish, that apparent kindness was always masking some hidden agenda, and these habits of mind were difficult to break. Emma patiently helped him work through these doubts, challenging him to examine his assumptions and consider alternative explanations for the kindness he witnessed, pointing out the logical flaws in his automatic skepticism. Her own example continued to serve as a beacon, demonstrating daily that integrity and compassion could coexist with practical intelligence and personal ambition. Emma was nobody's fool. She understood perfectly well how the world worked, how wealth and power usually operated, how people in her position were often exploited and dismissed. But she chose to respond to that understanding with determination to be different, rather than cynical acceptance of corruption as inevitable. Her strength came not from naivety, but from a conscious decision to maintain her values despite abundant evidence that the world often rewarded their opposite. Meanwhile, the question of the necklace's ultimate fate remained unresolved, hanging over their growing relationship like a benevolent sword of Damocles. Alexander had gathered extensive documentation of human goodness, filling notebooks with examples of selfless behavior in communities that functioned on principles of mutual aid and cooperation. But Emma continued to insist that accepting the family heirloom would compromise her principles unless the gesture felt entirely authentic, not motivated by guilt or pity or any desire to impress her. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected crisis that tested both their characters in ways neither had anticipated. Roberto, the restaurant manager who had revealed his own questionable ethics during the necklace incident, had been running a much more elaborate scam than anyone realized. For months, he had been systematically skimming money from employee tips, using his position and access to credit card processing systems to redirect portions of gratuities to his own accounts, while leaving servers like Emma to wonder why their income seemed to be declining despite consistent customer traffic. The theft was sophisticated enough to avoid detection through casual observation, requiring careful analysis of transaction records to identify the patterns of diversion. Emma discovered the scheme through the kind of meticulous attention to detail that had made her such an effective waitress and student. She had been tracking her own earnings carefully, concerned about her family's ongoing financial needs and trying to budget for Miguel's continued medical expenses. When she noticed consistent discrepancies between what customers indicated they were tipping and what appeared in her paycheck, she began keeping detailed records of every transaction, cross-referencing customer receipts with her reported income. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Someone with access to the system was stealing from the servers. When Emma brought her concerns to other employees, she discovered that several of them had noticed similar problems, but hadn't had the time or resources to investigate thoroughly. The servers most affected were those like herself, who depended entirely on tip income to support their families. People who couldn't afford to lose even small amounts without feeling the impact on their ability to pay rent and buy groceries. Roberto had been particularly clever in targeting employees who were unlikely to complain loudly or hire lawyers, people whose vulnerable circumstances made them less likely to pursue formal complaints. The discovery placed Emma in a terrible moral dilemma. Roberto was married with 2 young children, and exposing him would certainly cost him his job and possibly lead to criminal charges that could destroy his family's stability. His wife was a stay-at-home mother with no outside income, and his children attended the same elementary school where Emma worked part-time, sweet kids who obviously loved their father and depended on his stability. Yet staying silent meant allowing him to continue stealing from her colleagues, many of whom lived paycheck to paycheck and couldn't absorb even small losses without real hardship. Emma confided in Alexander about the situation, seeking his advice on how to handle such a morally complex problem, where any action would cause harm to innocent people. His initial response was to suggest immediate exposure and prosecution, seeing Roberto's behavior as yet another example of corruption that deserved swift punishment regardless of collateral damage. Roberto had made his choices, Alexander argued, and should face the consequences without consideration for how those consequences might affect his family. Justice required accountability, and accountability sometimes meant that innocent people suffered for the sins of those they were connected to. But Emma's more nuanced approach forced Alexander to consider the broader implications of their choices and the difference between justice and revenge. She pointed out that destroying Roberto's family wouldn't help the servers recover their stolen money, and that the children who would suffer most from their father's exposure bore no responsibility for his choices. Simply seeking punishment without considering mercy seemed inadequate to address the situation's complexity, particularly when there might be ways to achieve accountability while preserving the possibility of redemption and restitution. Together, they developed a plan that would address the theft while offering Roberto a chance at redemption, if he was willing to take it. Alexander would use his business connections to help Roberto find legitimate additional income through consulting work, using his restaurant management experience to help other establishments improve their operations. Emma would confront him privately about the stolen tips and demand their immediate return, along with a commitment to stop the theft permanently. If Roberto agreed to make full restitution and demonstrate genuine remorse, they would give him an opportunity to reform without destroying his life or his children's futures. If Roberto refused to acknowledge his behavior or continued stealing despite their intervention, they would have no choice but to involve law enforcement and restaurant ownership, accepting that his family would suffer for his continued choices. The approach balanced accountability with compassion, offering a path toward redemption while maintaining clear consequences for continued bad behavior. It was exactly the kind of nuanced moral reasoning that Alexander had learned to appreciate through his relationship with Emma, demonstrating that ethical choices often required more wisdom than simple adherence to abstract principles. We finished the first part here. Comment if you want part 2.